Okay, welcome everybody back to tutorials. My name is Casey Lee. So I'm going to delay a little bit in the beginning here just because last time I did this hour-and-a-half lecture, lots of good CSS stuff, and it turns out it didn't broadcast, so people couldn't see the video, and it did not record. So no one could see it after it was done, so it was a little bit of an annoyance. So what I'm going to do is I am basically going to do this broadcast until I kind of guarantee that there's something running. And good news is I have a secondary laptop just kind of in the background here. I'm logged into this, and it looks like it is playing. So I'm going to assume that things are recording right now. I'm going to check back every now and then on the question board. So if you're viewing this live, please write on the question board that you can see the video broadcast. Or if you can't, please mention them there. I know someone did last time, and I didn't catch it to the very end. So that was a little bit annoying. So it looks like things are running. It looks like things are good. Looks like William Lamb can see the video. So thanks to Will. Thanks for the confirmation. Even if this doesn't record properly, at least the video will be seen live by at least one person, so that's always good. Hopefully we'll get some other viewers in the future as well as we go along with this. Okay, so just a couple housekeeping issues. Again, if you guys are brand new to this, this is tutorials. It's a free comprehensive web course in Ruby on Rails. Currently in person, it's only available to University of Ottawa students, but we are going to be recording most of these things online, so you'll be able to view it on YouTube. And the next time I run it, I'll probably be more diligent with my recordings and maybe make the whole thing online. It seems to be getting a good response there. So very happy about that. Ottawa U students, starting next Monday, I believe we will have a room in person. I will tweet that, so you can follow me at CaseyLee23, or if you're subscribed to the newsletter, you can. I'll tell you what the room is. I'm very excited to get back in person. These online things are great for reviewing and stuff like that, but it's also nice to get some in-person time. So again, thanks to Will that you can see this video. If anybody else is on this Hangout, just wants to confirm that they can see the video broadcast, because again, I'd hate to go through an hour-and-a-half and not have any of this recorded. So thanks again to Will. So today what we'll be covering is we're going to start diving into the real meat of Ruby on Rails and some really good web programming principles. We're going to dive into something called REST today. Now, REST is a very, very theoretical concept. I guess you can't be very, very theoretical. There's a lot of abstract concepts when it comes to REST. It's a philosophy that can be applied to a lot of different technologies, and one of them is web. Web has implemented RESTful principles. Now, I cannot claim to be an expert on REST. I understand it a little bit to explain it, but to be honest, you don't have to understand fully what REST is all about to implement RESTful resources. Okay, if you follow the patterns that we design in this class, you will be building RESTful resources and RESTful endpoints and ultimately RESTful web services. So if you don't understand the theoretical part of it, don't worry. I don't really understand it that well myself. What's more important is you understand kind of the patterns that we're using. For example, RESTful resources have to be able to be created, read, updated, and destroyed. So if you create an object that can follow those four principles, then you're adhering to one of the principles of REST. If to do those actions, you're sending all the information you need to do those actions. So in other words, it's a stateless request. So it's not like you have to send one command and send another command. If one command has all the information it needs to update or destroy or whatever, that's another RESTful principle. So these are just examples of RESTful principles. So as you code RESTful web services and things like that, you'll see what these you'll be adhering to these principles. So again, if you don't understand REST in theory, that's fine. Just kind of follow along the examples, and inherently you will be coding a RESTful resource. Okay, and that's what we're getting to now. This is a big topic, and ultimately this is the bulk of the Ruby on Rails part in this course. I mean, there's a lot. Ruby on Rails is a huge thing, but this coding piece will take a couple of weeks, and we'll be building out this big resource. But as we build it piece by piece, you're going to understand a lot more things. You're going to understand more about controllers. You're going to understand more about routes. You're going to understand more about models. So today we, for the first time, dive into models, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'm just going to switch to my desktop, and if somebody can just post in the question answer area that they can see my desktop, that would be great. So I'm just going to, again, delay a little bit just to make sure, just because of the technical difficulties we had last time. I don't want to waste everybody's time, and I don't want to waste my time, to be honest, too. So if anybody in the question area can, Will, if you can also, anybody just message that they can see my desktop, then I'll get started. And until then, I'll blab a little bit more about this. So again, we're going to be diving into models. So there is some prerequisite learning that you guys have to know going into this. If you know about classes and instances, that will help you a lot in the next little while. Not only this week, but probably in the next couple weeks, if you know about classes and instances. If you don't know about classes and instances, again, you can still follow along, but I highly recommend you do a little bit of reading on what a class is and what an instance is. I'll probably talk a little bit introductorily about it. But that being said, if you don't have a good grounding in classes and instances, you might get a little bit lost. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't follow along. It looks like Will responded, so thanks again to Will that he can see the desktop. That's not to say you can't follow along, but it will be a little bit harder. Now, the other piece that is good to know ahead of time is databases. If you have some database experience, you'll find this next part a lot easier to understand. If you don't have database experience, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on that, because I know a lot of people don't have database experience. But again, I'm not going to go through all the ins and outs. I'm not going to give you a full SQL course. SQL is a good language to learn, because Ruby on Rails does a lot of that stuff in the background for you. It's very rare that you write your own SQL statements in Ruby on Rails. The only time you really do that is if you kind of want to optimize your SQL statements and stuff like that. But Ruby on Rails generally handles that stuff. Okay, so looks like our screen sharing is good. So let's get started here. Okay, so again, if you guys go to the main website, Casey Lee Tutorials, and you want to look for the slides that I'm following, building a RESTful resource is where we're at. But again, you can just pay attention and code along. We will be continuing on with the code that we have, that we've been doing all this time. Another thing to note is that last week I did some CSS and I pushed that code up. But that being said, we probably won't really use that code. That was more for demonstrations. It's kind of an aside. So if you missed last lecture, you can't go and view it. Actually, to be honest, everybody missed last lecture because it wasn't broadcast. It's not a big deal. The main thing you want to kind of watch maybe is the Ruby lecture. So if you go to the website, there's this Google Hangout on getting to know Ruby. We'll be using a lot of that stuff. So be sure to watch that if you haven't watched that already. Okay. Okay, so we're going to build a RESTful resource. Okay, so let me review just a little bit what I've been trying to drive home all this time. And the one thing that I say, if you memorize this, you should be pretty much able to sit down at any Rails application and start to code on it, or at least start to investigate on it. And that's this diagram here. So this is something we went over in class way back, probably December, maybe November even. And the whole idea is that the web is all about request and response. Okay, that was a big thing that I emphasized in class, request and response. And then what Web 2.0 was all about was sending a request, doing server-side processing, and then generating a response. Okay, so sending a request, doing server-side processing, and then sending a response back. Now, this is something that I had you guys stand up in class and recite over and over again because, again, almost all Web 2.0 languages work this way, okay? Like JSP or Java Server Pages, Microsoft.NET's web component, Ruby on Rails, PHP. There's all these other web languages, web frameworks that use this same principle, is that request, server-side processing, and response. Now, Ruby on Rails, again, and specifically, does it using these files and classes. So the idea is that any request that comes into Ruby on Rails hits the routes file. The routes file will analyze that request and tell it to go to a certain controller and action. So an action is just a method within the controller. And then that controller can do whatever it wants to do. It can program whatever it wants to program, okay? And then it can spit out a view template, okay? It can basically do any processing that it needs to do, and then spit out any information back as a HTML file back to the browser, okay? Now, we just started to get into this before the holiday break, and this is kind of what we were working on, okay? So what we were working on was we were working on creating this pages controller. So if you open up Sublime Text and you go and you open up your test app, again, for those of you who are new to the course, you can always clone my GitHub repository, so github.com/KCLee/testapp. This is a public repository, and this is where I push all the code at the end of every lecture. Okay. But what we were working on is we were working basically on demoing this concept here. Okay. Sending in a request that hits the routes file. The routes file goes to a controller action, which goes to a view template and throws back. And optionally goes to a model. We haven't talked about the model yet. We haven't talked about the database. That's what this 3-cylinder thing is, by the way, is a database. We haven't talked about any of this yet, okay? So we only talked about this path right here, okay? So what we said is we started defining a route in the routes file, okay? So this is under config routes, okay? A shortcut that you really want to start to get used to, guys, in Sublime is Control P in Windows and Linux, and Command P in Mac. Okay, so that's Control P in Windows and Linux. Okay, and Command P in Mac. Okay, so what that does is, if you're in Sublime and you hit that, it basically brings you up a file search. Okay, so you can start typing a file name. So let's say I want to jump to routes.rb. I can just start typing ROU, and then you see routes.rb is there, okay? If I want to jump to index.html, I can do Command P and start typing index, and then I'm there, okay? Command P is going to be your best friend throughout all this, okay? So it's a really nice way to jump to different files rather than having to look through them through here, okay? But in case you're wondering, routes.rb is under the config folder, okay? Under test app config, routes.rb. Okay, so last time we talked about this, we started coding this these routes, and I have a little comment up there that shows you what that's all about. The format it usually is the type of request that it is, okay? The request itself, a better way to look at this is maybe URL, okay? So the type of request, okay? The URL of the request, and an equal sign arrow, okay? Equals greater than. And that'll lead to some kind of controller, hashtag, and the action. Okay. So ultimately what this does is it maps a request to a controller method, okay? If you recall, under app, under controllers, under pages controller, we can have as many methods as we want here, okay? So those who are familiar with object-oriented programming, this is a class definition, okay, class end. And the way you define methods in Ruby is def, the name of the method, and an end, okay? So for Java programmers, you're probably used to something like this, okay? In Ruby, okay, it's define, the method name, and then end. So Ruby uses a lot of beginning and end keywords rather than using curly braces. Actually, it's very, very few places that Ruby uses curly braces. One of the main places is passing blocks of code, but we'll get into that later. Okay, so you can have as many methods as you want here, and just like in HTML, how you can type something then tab. Sublime has plugins for Ruby as well, where you can type def tab and then start typing the method name. So you could say about, def contact, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you can have as many methods as you want in here. Now, again, what I said is that methods inside a controller class, we call them actions. Okay, it's just a different name for methods of a controller. Okay, so we have this pages controller, and now we have 3 methods: home, about, and contact. Okay, so basically what we can do in the routes file is we can access any one of those. We can say if the browser sends us a /home request, okay, and this /home is relative to the host, by the way. So our host is localhost 3000 /home. Then what that says is go process that in the pages controller, the home action. Okay, and then I also demonstrated you can have multiple routes pointing to the same controller action. So /house could point to pages home, right? It doesn't have to be the same name, right? I mean, it probably makes more sense to have the same name, but it's not always the case. I mean, you may have something like, say, contact us forwards to pages contact. Okay. Now, if you're using double quotations like I do, you'll notice when you type a hash sign that it brings up these curly braces. Now, if you watch the last lecture, you'll know that's all about string interpolation. That's just Sublime doing a best guess. In this case, we don't like get rid of those curly braces. We don't need them. Okay. So hashtag contact. If you're using single quotations, Sublime won't make that best guess because there's no string interpolation in single quotations. Okay. So again, last time we talked about this. It's the type of request, the URL, and then pages, and then controller and action. Okay. Now, what we also talked about last time, so I'm just going to get rid of this. Okay. And pages controller, I'm just going to get rid of the home, the about, and contact. Just go back to what we had. Okay. Now that when I type in /home, it goes to the pages controller, the home action. This is where we do server-side processing. Okay, so you can do any Ruby code that you want on here. And remember, this is running on your web server. Okay, so wherever your web server is running, this is the code that's happening there. Okay, so let me bring this diagram back up. Okay, so when we're in the controller, this is all on your web server. Okay, so if you have files on this web server, if you have images, whatever you have on this side, you can work with. If you have access to a database, if you have access to shell commands and stuff like that, you can run that all here before you return the response back to the browser. So remember, this browser is sitting on your customers, like the person who's accessing your website. This is their browser sitting on their computer, and all this code in here is running on the web server or your computer. Okay. So server-side processing is what we can do here. So usually what server-side processing breaks down into, there's really 2 things that it can do. Okay, there are 2 kind of categories that server-side processing generally resides into. Okay, one, okay, is doing kind of calculations, okay, or data manipulation, or data reading. Okay, so in other words, if you want to kind of, let's say somebody submits a form. Okay, that may be a request that comes in here. Let's say you want to take that form and you want to massage the data and save that data. That's one of the things you might do in server-side processing. Okay, you might read the data, you might save it, you may even extract data that was already saved previously. That's the kind of stuff you might do there. And then the second main thing you would do in the controller is basically prepare your response. Okay, so this diagram here, a request comes into routes. Routes just tells it where to go to in the controller. And then the controller can do a whole whack of things. Okay? It can do a bunch of calculations. It can do any processing that you need to do. It can save data. It can read data, whatever it needs to do. Okay? And then it's going to prepare the response. Now, usually that response is a web page. Okay? So if somebody submits a form, usually you give them a page back that says, thank you for submitting your response. We'll get back to you shortly. Or maybe if somebody clicks on a link, you want to prepare a response for that as well. You want to, you want to give them the page for that. So that's the response is usually a web page that goes back. Okay. Now, what's really cool is that you can actually set up a lot of complex data in to do calculations, you do data manipulation, you do data reading, and then you also prepare your response. Okay. Now, for this very simple example that we were working on since December, we basically said we're not going to do anything here. Okay, nothing. We're not going to do any calculations. We're not going to do any data manipulation. All we're going to do is when somebody requests /home, we're going to return them a web page that says, welcome to my website or whatever. Okay, so this is all a repeat from November, but it's been a while since we've been here. But basically what I told you is there's a way that you can render a specific template, okay? And the way you can do that is you can basically say render, okay, and then the name of the template, okay? So in my case, it'll be home. Okay? So where does this template exist? Where does the code for this HTML page exist? Well, that's your view, okay? That's your view template, okay? So we have controllers, we have models, and we have views, okay? And where does it look for it? Well, every controller is going to have a corresponding folder, okay? So the pages controller has a corresponding pages folder. And in that folder, you're going to have the name of the templates. So you're going to have as many templates as you want here, okay? And to render that template, you say render home. And what render is going to do is it's going to package this HTML page in a nice little package, okay, and then send it back as the response to the user, okay? Now, the other thing it does before that is it places this HTML inside the default layout HTML. Okay, now I had a question in class that said, well, what if we don't want all this JavaScript and all this header stuff? Well, you can actually create different layouts, but again, that's for a future lecture. For now, just look at it as this layout applies to every single response, every single HTML response. And what you do is whatever's in your HTML template gets put into wherever this yield is. Okay, so what if I go back to the pages controller, what render home exactly does is it takes the home HTML.erb, takes this here, okay, puts it inside of here, and then returns this whole page back. Okay, so that's how this all works. All right, so let's see if this works. So if you launch up your terminal, okay, and let me make this a little bit higher for you guys. Okay, so if you launch up your terminal and you navigate to your Rails, your dev folder, your Rails projects, your test app, and you fire up your Rails server, so Rails S. Okay, there we go, it's running. Then I just have to fire up localhost. By default, the port's 3000. And now I type in my request. So relative to the host and port, I can type in my request. My request is /home. Okay. Now, anytime you type a URL into an address bar, just so you know, that is a GET request. Okay. Requests to the web server can be of many types. There's GET, there's PUT, there's DELETE, there's POST, there's a bunch. Okay. But anytime you type into a address bar like this, you're sending a GET request. So what you're doing is you're sending a GET request to localhost 3000, okay? So what that's going to do is that's going to match this route here, which matches pages home. And then that goes to here, which all this does is called render home. And what render home does is it takes the home.html.erb, throws that into here, and returns that as a response. So I hit enter, and that's what happens, okay? So that web page came back. So if I view the page source, you'll see it's got all this HTML, H1, and so on and so forth. Okay, there we go. Okay, so that is what we went over in November. Okay, so now let's play with this a little bit, because last lecture, the one that we actually recorded, was all about getting to know Ruby. Now, what is this .erb? This .erb extension here. What that .erb extension is it's called embedded Ruby. Okay, so what that is you can actually have a web page, and you can scatter throughout it. Ruby code. Okay, now I have to warn you, this is embedded Ruby and only works as part of this loop. Where is it? This loop here, okay? Because Ruby on Rails is doing the processing before it spits this HTML page back, okay? we can do some smart things here, okay? You can't do this in regular HTML. You can't just put Ruby code in HTML and expect the browser to do it. No, the browser only understands languages like CSS, JavaScript, HTML. It doesn't understand anything about Ruby code. Okay, so for example, let's look at this here. Okay, so let's say my home page, I have welcome home, and then I have a paragraph here. Okay, and let's put some lorem ipsum text here, and then let's have another paragraph. And here, let's put some Ruby code. Okay, so for those of you who weren't here or who have not watched the other lecture, I'm going to start up a new terminal tab here. So I have one tab that runs my server, another tab that's just open here. I'm going to open up another tab here. Okay, you can open up a new window or whatever. And I'm going to type in IRB. Again, IRB is just playground where you can test any Ruby code out you want. Okay, so if I do like 1 + 1, for example, Ruby evaluates that to 2. You know, if I do a string here and I do dot uppercase, you know, that'll uppercase my string. Okay, if I do, you know, hello and do reverse, that'll reverse my string. Okay, so this is all stuff in that recorded lecture. Okay, so this is all Ruby code. Okay, so if I put straight up Ruby code into the HTML, let's see what happens. So let's do 1 + 1. Okay, so this is an ERB file. So maybe I can just put random Ruby code in there and something will happen. Let's see what happens. Okay, so if I refresh the page. All right, so there's my welcome home header. There's my lorem ipsum text, and no, it looks like 1 + 1 just spit out 1 + 1. And that makes sense because I mean regular HTML, that's how it would look. But there's an ERB extension there. Wouldn't it evaluate it? No, you have to tell the ERB file what is regular HTML and what is embedded Ruby. Okay, you have to explicitly explain to Ruby on Rails saying, okay, all this stuff that I'm typing here, this is just regular HTML. But I'm going to put some Ruby code in there, and I want you to interpret that Ruby code first and translate that to some kind of HTML before you return this page. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we mark certain pieces of this page as Ruby code versus HTML code? We use what's called server-side tags. Okay, so there's 2 flavors of this, by the way. There's server-side tags that look like this. Okay, so it's less, so it kind of looks like HTML, but it has a % sign. Okay, so less than %, and then you put a bunch of Ruby code in here, and then % greater than. Okay, that's one flavor of it. And then the second flavor of it looks like this. It's almost the exact same, except there's an equal sign. Okay, so what's the difference between these 2 server tags? Okay, this server tag, Ruby will evaluate it, and whatever the output is, okay, whatever the output of this is, it will not actually display this in the HTML page. In other words, it won't actually be replaced with any HTML. Okay, so what happens is you basically get an evaluation of this, but nothing actually gets spit out in place of this. Okay, so if I were to write like, this is sample server code, okay, and then I'll put and can you see it? And then for this one, I'll put this is sample server. This is another sample server code. Do you see it? Okay, now I'm going to put these in 2 separate paragraphs so we can distinguish these easily. Okay, so there we go. We have 2 things there. Okay, so let's put some Ruby code in here. Okay, so these are server-side tags. So what this says is anything in between these tags, you can put Ruby code. Okay, PHP has something similar. If you guys are PHP developers, PHP looks like this. Okay, I believe Java server pages uses this same syntax. I can't remember what .NET uses actually. Okay, so this is sample server code, and I'm going to put some random Ruby code in here. So say 2 + 3. That's valid Ruby code. So what Ruby is going to do is it's going to evaluate that. Okay, Ruby on Rails is going to evaluate that. And then what it's going to do which kind of sounds weird, is that it's basically going to replace this with nothing. Okay, because there's no equal sign in there, it's not going to actually replace it with anything. Now, it'll become very apparent in a second why you would use this instead of the equal sign. Okay, this is more for control structures, which we'll talk about later, like if statements and loops and stuff like that. Okay, or initialization of variables and stuff like that. Okay, so this is sample server code. There we go. And then here, let's do another one. So let's say 3 plus 4. Okay, so what if what I'm saying is true? Then you'll say this is sample server code, and then nothing, and then this is another sample server code, and then 3 plus 4 is 7, so it'd be 7. Do you see it? Okay, so let's refresh that page and see what happens. Bam. Okay, so here you see this is sample server code, and then there's nothing in there. And can you see it? And this is another sample server code, 7. Do you see it? Okay, and let's look at the HTML of this. Let's inspect the element. Okay, and you see this paragraph. See, paragraph. This is sample server code, and there's just a blank space in there. And can you see it? It's as if nothing existed there. And then here, this is another sample server code, and then 7 is there. Okay, so this is how embedded Ruby works. You can put pieces of Ruby code inside your HTML. And why would you want to do that? Because Ruby is a smarter, more powerful language in a lot of ways, right? It can do calculations, it has methods, it has classes, it has all these things. Like, for example, let's say you want to do, you know, have a string here and reverse it. Okay, so I refresh, you see, ole. So hello backwards is ole. I mean, you don't have the ability to reverse strings in HTML. All you do have basically is a way to display stuff. So this is really interesting. Okay, so now, again, if I want to show the result of this, all I have to do is put an equal sign in there. Okay, there you go. Sample server code 5, another sample server code ole. Okay, so this is why these views, these pieces of HTML code, are called templates. Okay, because a template is something that you fill out, right? It's kind of like a form or like a preset kind of page that's filled out with information, right? And so you can imagine very simply, let's say there's a page where the user fills out their information and then it spits out a nice little letter to them, okay? Well, you could see just as easily, let me get rid of all this text, you could see something like, you know, dear, you know, somebody, let's say username. Okay, and then you could see how it would be like, dear username, we have billed your account in the amount of, and then say user balance. Okay, please pay by user due date, something like that, right? Thank you. Okay, so you can see how this is a template, right? It's like a form, and then for the currently logged in user to find their username, their balance, and their due date, and put it in this little form that they have. Okay. Now, that's generally how you can put embedded Ruby inside a Vue template. Okay. Now, things get a little interesting here. Okay, so let's say now, I mean, username, user balance, and user due date aren't all, in this case, they're all not assigned, right? They're non-declared variables at this point. Okay, so what I could do is I could declare these variables if I wanted. Okay, and let's say I want to declare the variable, but I don't want to output the result of that declaration. Okay, because like let's look at this. If we go back here and we actually declare something in IRB, so say username equals Casey Lee. You'll see the way it evaluates that, just that assignment statement, is it evaluates it to the value of the string. Now, if I want to just assign it but not actually output this, that's where I can use these other things, these non-equal server-side tags. Okay, so now because there's no equal signs here, the evaluations of these statements will not be output to this HTML. So this will be as if this didn't exist. But the really nice thing is this Ruby code all connects to each other. So because you assign username up here, the username can actually persist down to here, okay, and user balance and so on and so forth. So let's look at it. So refresh. There we go. Dear Casey Lee, we have billed your account in the amount of $200. Please pay by January 3rd, 2015. Okay, so we're now using Ruby code within our HTML. Okay, so this is what the render function ultimately does. Okay, so in Pages controller, this render thing does a lot of stuff. Okay, one of the things it does is it goes and finds the template. Okay, so the template exists in the views, pages folder, home.html ERB. Then the second thing it does is it evaluates all the Ruby code. Okay, so it takes the Ruby code and whatever the value is, okay, it replaces it with HTML if there's an equal sign. Okay, so the evaluation of username is Casey Lee. So just replace this entire thing, okay, with Casey Lee. That's what it's doing, okay? We'll replace user balance with 200. Replace user due date with January 30th, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's how you embed Ruby into here. Okay. Then the third thing it does is it takes the final HTML version of this, okay, after it's processed all the embedded Ruby, takes the final HTML of that, slaps it into this layout, and then returns that as the response. Okay, that's where it comes there. So you can start to see, like, I mean, we're not quite there yet, but you can start to see, oh, this would be cool if I can grab the currently logged in user, the user's balance, and the user's due date, and throw them into here, right? I mean, this still doesn't look like it makes a lot of sense because here we're just kind of hard coding stuff up here. Why don't we just hard code that stuff in here, right? But you'll see as our data becomes dynamic, okay, and we can say just get the currently logged in user, or do this for every user, or whatever, like loop through and do through a bunch of users. You can see how this will become very, very handy. Okay. Now, two more concepts when it comes to embedded Ruby. Okay. The first one is probably the first very useful case of this. Okay. First very useful argument for embedded Ruby, and that's the idea of introducing control structures into your HTML. Okay. HTML has no concept of control structures. Well, very little at least. Okay, there's some like pseudocode or like commented code that IE understands, stuff like that. But in general, HTML has no concept of control structures. And what do I mean by control structures? I mean if statements, loops, you know, while loops, for loops, you know, all these kind of things, switch statements. These are things that programmers use all the time to make their code more efficient, you know, and you know, HTML doesn't have this concept. So let me put this in action for you guys. Okay, so let's say we had a list here, so an unordered list, and we'll have list items, and we will say, okay, so let's say your usage for week 1 was 40 gigs. Okay, your usage for week 2 was 60 gigs. Your usage for week 3 was 80 gigs. And then your usage for week 4 was 20 gigs. Okay. So obviously you can see we're starting to repeat ourselves. What happens if I want to change the wording of this? Well, now I have to select all these and change them all. I mean, in Sublime, it's a little bit easier, but we're still creating, I mean, the whole point of don't repeat yourself is not so that you don't have to type more, but it's more for that you're less prone to errors, right? If I change it in one place and I change it in 4 other places, I'm more prone to errors than if I just have to change it in one place, right? So here we go. Now, in Java and C# and all this stuff, you'd normally say, well, we could easily do this with a loop, right? We would put these values into an array, loop through it, and output this. But we can't do that in regular HTML. But we can do that in server-side languages like Ruby on Rails with embedded Ruby. So let me show you what this looks like. So what you can use this non-equal version of the server tag for are control statements. Okay, so let me remind you what a Ruby loop might look like. Okay, so back here, okay, if we're just in straight up Ruby, I might have an array that looks like this. Okay, so 40, 60, 80, 20. Okay, that's an array. That's how you declare an array. So on the array itself, you can assign the array to a variable if you want. So I could say a equals 40, 60, 80, 20. Okay, so I have this array called a. Now on the array itself, you could do dot each. Okay, and then you pass in a block of code that looks like this. Okay, and then you can do something with that code. So you can say put s, your usage was usage. Okay, and this is from the Getting to Know Ruby lecture. Okay, but this is basically what a loop looks like with an array. Okay, you can do a dot each do, and then this do end block. Okay, this do end piece here, you can kind of view that as a function that's going to run for every element in a. Okay, this is how you kind of read it. You kind of read the do end as an argument to this a dot each. Okay, so if you didn't catch that, what a loop looks like is this, an each loop at least. Okay, that's what it looks like. But again, the do end, this you can kind of read as like one function. Okay, that's going to execute for every element. Now, element you can name whatever you want. This is a variable name you give that you can use within the block to represent every element of the array. Okay, now when we're doing this in IRB, we're using put s because put s outputs it to the screen. But put s doesn't exist in HTML, so how can we do that in HTML? So this is the really cool part, is how you can actually mix ERB with HTML. Okay, so let's start with an array. Okay, so a equals, let's actually name it something useful. So usage values. Okay, so 40, 60, 80, 20. Okay. And because we're kind of initializing all our variables up top, let's just do some good practice and put that back up top. Okay, so we have usage values here. So now here's where we can do a loop. It's pretty cool. So usage values dot each do, and each one we'll call, say, value, or whatever you want. And we'll do end. And then in the middle, okay, so we have the declaration and the end. All right, so the declaration and the end. And in the middle, we can just do stuff. And that do stuff is we'll actually just put out some HTML. Get rid of all this. So this is a weird kind of mix you're doing here. So you're doing some Ruby, you're doing a Ruby loop, but the actual do stuff in the middle is you're writing HTML. So what's going to happen is that this HTML is going to output for every value here. Okay, so let's see what happens if we just save that. Okay, so not quite what we're looking for. What we have here is your usage for week 1 was 40 gigs. Well, that kind of makes sense because I just hard-coded this line here. And this line is executing for every value in usage values, which is there's 4 of them, right? So it just outputs it 4 times. So let's fix the 40 gigs first, okay? So we're going to replace 40 with the value. But now, again, this value only exists in the Ruby world. Remember, all these server-side tags is in the Ruby world, okay? So to access that value, we have to just do this. It's server-side tags again. Now this one we want to output the value, so we hit equals. But because you're using the equal version, this is actually going to evaluate this and put it here. This value is coming from this loop here, okay? And because they're all in the Ruby world, they all understand each other. Okay, so let's save that, refresh. Hey, that's getting better. So 40 gigs, 60 gigs, 80 gigs, 20 gigs. But the week is not quite right. We need the week, right? Now, a smart way to do this is we probably just want to use the index. So how do we get the index from this loop? Well, arrays actually have another type of loop. I mean, they have a loop called .each, which just returns the value. But they also have a each with index, which returns the value and the index. Okay, so now we can put the index here. Okay, so less than % equals index %, close that off. Okay, so again, all these server-side tags, okay, all this stuff here, anything with an equals is going to be replaced by a value. Okay, so all that stuff is going to be filled out and then replaced. Okay, you'll never see username, user bound. You'll never see any of this stuff on the HTML side because render processes this file, then returns it back to the user. Okay, not bad. Usage for week 0, 1, 2, 3, 1, or 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And that's because this is zero-based index, like most languages. So all we have to do is add 1 to the index. Your usage for week 1 is 40 gigs. Your usage for week 2 is 60, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you can already see how this is starting to get really useful. Now, if I ever want to add more values, right? I mean, 30, 50, 20, this thing just grows, right? You just have to output it. And let's say I want to change the wording. I only have to change the wording here, right? Your data usage. Okay, refresh that. We're good to go. Okay, you can also do the same thing with if statements. Okay, you could do if, you know, some condition. So let's say 1 equals 1. Else, show this. Okay, you may see something like, you can see a useful case for that. So for example, if you had a variable called user signed in, if the user is signed in, show a sign out link. If the user is not signed in, show a sign in link. You'll see all that stuff. Now, this is just a taste of ERB. We will be doing this over and over again. So if this went over a little bit over your head, again, the nice thing is this is a recorded video, so go back and watch it. But we'll be doing this over and over again, okay? The take-home message right now is that ERB files are templates, which are basically HTML code scattered with server-side Ruby code, okay? And what rendering does is it takes the Ruby code, evaluates it, replaces any values that needs to with proper HTML or just text, okay, which browsers understand, and then returns that to the user. Okay, so if I'm here and I view page source, you'll see there's no way of the user knowing how this was actually generated, right? How do they know that I didn't just manually type this all out? It's possible, right? They have no idea. And this is what Web 2.0 is all about. We're using Ruby code to generate HTML for us so we don't have to write it. Okay, so we don't have to write the HTML code ourselves. We let Ruby do some smart things like loop over things and write the code for us. That's what Web 2.0 is all about. Okay, so we learned 2 new pieces of syntax here: server-side tag without an equal sign, server-side tag with an equal sign. Okay. Now we're going to go into a related concept, but a new concept. Okay, we talked about embedded Ruby. Now I want to talk about cleaning this code up, okay? So here what I've been doing is I've been initializing all my variables here, and maybe I do some calculations even up here, right? Maybe I want to capitalize the name or something like that, right? And do all that stuff. Now it's kind of interesting because what's really starting to get bad about this code is I'm starting to do a lot of kind of server-side processing and calculations and complex stuff inside the view. Okay, a view should be all about just presenting data. It shouldn't have to do like any initialization, any finding of data, any saving of data, any calculations of data. It shouldn't have to do any of that stuff, okay? What we typically put that code in is the controller. Okay, typically code like initializing or reading from the database or doing complex calculations. I mean, let's say you had a complex calculation with user balance. Okay, let's say user balance was really like last balance, subtract, payments, plus interest, stuff like that. I mean, this starts to get really funky because the view should only be responsible for displaying that final result. It shouldn't be responsible for doing all this in the view. So putting this code in here is actually getting really ugly, and we shouldn't be doing that. Okay. Now, again, in this case, maybe it doesn't look so bad because all we're doing is initialization, but even still, you want to get in the habit of putting code in the right place. So code like this is generally okay in the view. Okay, if you need to loop to create more view elements, that makes sense. If you're just filling in data, where text is, that's fine. You're just putting in variables, okay, where they belong. That's fine too. But initialization, calculations, processing, anything along those lines does not belong here. It actually belongs in the controller. So the question is, how do we get data from the controller into the view? It's actually quite easy. Okay, so let's say I want to move all this information to the controller. Okay, so the way we do that is you basically have to remember that we are going through this process, right? A request comes into routes, routes goes to a controller action, the controller action goes to the view template, okay? So the only thing that's executed on the controller is that specific method we're talking about. So if we're gonna move any code, it's gotta be into that controller action. Okay, so this home template in the pages controller, if we're gonna move this code anywhere, it should be in the home method. Okay, should be in the home action here. So let's just copy and paste that first. Okay, so let's just start cut and paste it. So let's cut it out of here. And let's paste it into this first category of calculation, data manipulation, data reading. Okay, now we got some bad syntax highlighting here, and that's because these server-side tags don't really make sense anymore because we're inside a Ruby file. Right over here, we are in an HTML ERB file, so we need these server tags to say, hey, this is HTML, this is server-side. But here, this is Ruby. Sorry, this is a Ruby class. This is a Ruby file, .rb. So we don't need these server-side tags anymore. Okay. So I'm just going to get rid of them. And I don't need their closing versions either. Okay, there we go. So they're defined. So this is nice. Now, okay, we have username equals case.ly. Now remember, Ruby doesn't need semicolons, so this is just a valid statement, valid statement, valid statement, valid statement. Okay, so now we've declared these variables inside Pages controller, and let's save both files. Okay, make sure you save both files. Okay, and let's refresh it and see what happens. We should get an error. And we do. And what is the error? So here it says, okay, so there's an undefined local variable or method called username, and it's, where is it happening? It's around line 1, okay, and it's in the apps, views, pages, home.html, the ERB file. It's in this file, line number 1. Okay, so what is that saying? So in this file, line number 1, it says username is not defined. Okay, so just moving that code into here looks like it's not going to give us the variables that we have here. Okay, so right now it looks like this template, okay, whoops, didn't mean that. This template has no notion of any of the information here. Okay, so how do we link these two? We use something called instance variables. Okay, now for those who are familiar with object-oriented programming, you'll know exactly what instance variables are. Okay, but instance variables inside a inside a controller class have a very specific behavior. Okay, they have all the behavior of everything else you can think of. Okay, if the object's still in memory, then the instance variable is a piece of data that's attached to an instance, so on and so forth. Okay, but all you need to know here, if you've never done object-oriented programming before, is that any instance variable you declare inside an action will be accessible to whatever view you end up rendering. Okay, so if I establish instance variables here, they will be accessible in this home template. Okay, so how do I establish an instance variable in the Ruby language? All you have to do is use the @ sign before any variable name. Okay, so @username, @userbalance, @userdue-date, @usage values. Okay. So just by doing that, you've created an instance variable. Okay. Now, instance variables now are accessible anywhere in the template that you end up rendering, in this case, home. Okay. Now, the thing is, though, we have to call them the same thing in the template as well. So in the template, we have to put @ signs as well. At. Now, these are not instance variables because these are coming from the loop. Okay, so we don't need to change those. Just need to change any of these guys that we initialize. Okay, so once again, to create an instance variable, you just put an @ sign in front of a variable name, and then that will be accessible anywhere in the template that you end up rendering. Okay, very special case of instance variables. Instance variables of controller classes. Okay, instance variables of other classes don't have this property. Okay, this is just a very specific instance in Ruby on Rails. So now if we refresh the page, everything's working again. And you can see how clean our view is now, right? And you could imagine somebody designing the view and designing the logic, okay? If somebody's designing the view, they can say, okay, all I know is that in the end, I'm going to display the user balance. I don't care how you calculate that. I don't care how you come about that. All I know is that I'm going to display the user balance. So one person can work on this and only concentrate on how they're going to display this. Whereas the person behind the scenes can work on this user balance here. You could say, you know, if at user balance is greater than $200, then maybe there's a cap, okay? So it's $200, okay? So let's say it was $240, okay? Then there's a cap, it always rounds down to $200. Otherwise, if it's like 180 and so on and so forth. So all this logic can be one programmer, and then how it's displayed is another programmer. So really nice separation of logic there. Okay, that's why I say calculations, data manipulation, data reading, and all that stuff comes from, is one of the things that the server side does in the controller, okay? And then that gets spit out to here, okay? Okay, so that is really the extent I want to go into about ERB right now, because we're going to be using ERB a lot when we're creating our RESTful resources. In fact, I didn't realize it would take me this long, and I kind of went off on a tangent. What we're talking about today is really more about ERB and how to get instance variables inside the ERB and how to use Ruby code in the ERB. I didn't really get into RESTful resources right now. So I'll probably create some lecture slides on this because we really didn't get into what I was planning to get into. So that's good. We'll get into that next week when we're actually in person. Okay. So really quick review. Okay, so I recapped that this is the holy grail of Ruby on Rails when it comes to request, server-side processing, response. Today, we did not talk anything about the model. That'll all be next week. The only thing we talked about today is the routes, controller, and the view template. Okay, we talked about that you can send a request to the routes file. That'll send it to a controller action. Controller action should render some view template to return back to the browser. Then we talked about how that rendering, okay, that rendering method, render home, is going to look for a view template, process any embedded Ruby tags, processing any server-side tags, and replace it with text, okay, so that HTML can understand it, browsers can understand it. Places this whole thing inside this layout and returns that to the browser. And then the last thing we talked about is it's good to separate your calculations, your data manipulation, your data reading, all that stuff, and whittle it down to just instance variables. And the way you do that is you do that all in the controller. And the way these are linked is you declare instance variables by using the @ sign. Okay. So now this specifically here, okay, equals may kind of qualify in preparing your response, because you're basically preparing instance variables to be used in your response. So you might, you know, classify this as prepare your response, and maybe calculations are more like, you know, at user balance, you know, is equal to $200 if at user balance is greater than, you know, $150, then reset that to $150, right? And so all the calculations here, and then here you're just kind of prepping the data itself. Okay, doesn't matter how you categorize it, to be honest. I just want to let you know that this is basically what server side does. Okay, you do all these calculation, data manipulation, stuff like that. Then you set up all your instance variables that your view is going to end up using. Okay, let me check if there's any quick questions here. Okay, some people, Sean Floyd just mentioned that .NET also uses the same syntax for server-side code, so thanks for that. Looks like Will lost the broadcast a little bit earlier, and he said it came back, so hopefully we didn't lose it all. Okay, so that is embedded Ruby. Okay, now I just want 2 more concepts to cover, and then we'll call it a night for tonight. 2 more concepts to cover. One I've already covered actually, and I just want to repeat it because it's been a little while. Okay, Ruby on Rails is all about this concept called convention over configuration. Okay, and what that means, what convention over configuration means? Okay, convention over configuration. Okay, and what that basically means, and you'll see this time and time again. Okay, you'll see this time and time again, especially when we get into the models and all this stuff like that. What that means is, if you follow our, and by our I mean Ruby on Rails developers, conventions, okay? If you follow our conventions, and we're talking naming conventions, coding conventions, you know, whatever, okay? If you follow their architectural conventions even, okay, if you follow their conventions, then you won't have to do any configuration. That's what convention over configuration means. Now, what does that mean? Okay, let me give you a very simple example. Actually, I'll give you a very simple example with what I'm going to show you right now. Okay, so it says, okay, we've already actually seen this. If you name your your template folder the same as your controller, then you don't have to tell us where to look for the template. Okay, so what does that mean? I technically, if I wanted to, could have named this folder whatever I wanted. Under the views, I could have called it, you know, templates, or I could have called it my pages or whatever, okay? But because I named it the same as pages controller, okay, then here I don't have to do the extra configuration step of saying render pages/home. And now there are instances where you may need to do that, but it's basically saying if you name the folder where the template is sitting in the same as the controller, then this saves you of that little configuration step. Okay, that's an example of convention over configuration. Another way to look at this is really convention over extra coding. Okay, is really what it comes down to. You'll see a lot of examples of this. I'm going to give you another useful example. If your controller action is the same as your template name, then you don't have to tell us what to render. So what does that mean? All right, so pages controller, right, we've already named them the same as the folder, so we don't have to tell it where to look. But if the action, which is home, is named the same as the template, which is home, then I actually don't need to configure this to render home. I can actually just get rid of this line. That's what it does by default. Okay, so somewhere in the Ruby on Rails code, it says, look for a template named the same as this method. Somewhere in the Ruby on Rails code, that's being done. Okay, so that's an example of convention over configuration, or the way I like to look at it, convention over extra coding. Okay, So rather than you having to type render home, it's just assumed. Now, if you want to render some other template, then yes, you have to tell it that. But if it's following the regular conventions, then you don't. Next week, we'll see that we start to deal with classes, model classes, and database tables. And another example is if you name your model class the same as the plural version of your database table, the singular version of your database table, we'll hook them up. And you'll see that next week, okay? But really, this is a lot of explanation to basically tell you that you don't need render home. It doesn't do any harm if you want to be more explicit about it, but following the Rails convention, because it's the same name, I don't have to actually code it. So what they say basically is name things the way we name things. So if you name it home, then make sure you name your template home, okay? And then you won't have to do any extra coding. You follow our conventions, and then you don't have to do any extra coding. Okay, so I'm just gonna get rid of some of this comments here, and then really what we're whittled down to is this. So that's kind of a nice little method. Okay, that's the first thing. That's the first little trick I want to tell you about. Okay, and you'll learn a lot of convention over configuration tricks. Okay, and the thing is, again, you'll just tell yourself, well, why would I name it anything differently? If I name it this way, then it just saves me all the coding that I have to do. Okay. For those of you who heard my talk about why Ruby on Rails, I mean, it's one of the big selling points about Ruby on Rails. Okay. The last point I want to make before we left is I want to talk a little bit about the routes. And there's two things I want to talk about here. The first is how do you assign the route path? Okay, there's two ways you can do it. You can do something like this. And what I mean by the route path is what happens when I type in just localhost /3000. Okay, there's a couple ways you could do it. I mean, you could do get slash. You could do that and assign it to whatever you want. I mean, we only have one action right now, so I'll do that. More conventional way of doing this, though, is just using the keyword, sorry, not the keyword, the method route. Okay, so you just say route, and then you specify what you want. Now, something interesting is going to happen here, which is my second thing that I want to talk about, okay, when it comes to routes. So the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to routes is just this method route. It's a way to specify what happens when you don't type anything after your host import. The second thing I want to specify, though, is this little error that we're going to see. Okay, so watch now when I type in localhost 3000 and then slash with no actual thing after. If I hit enter, you'll see I am not at my page's home, which it should be what it's going to. I'm at some other site here, actually. Not a site, actually. This is a page that I coded a little while back. And that page was actually public index.html. That's this page right here. So why is, if I'm in the routes section that says route this, why is it still going to this public index.html? Well, there's one little caveat that I did not mention about how this routing works. Okay, a request comes in, and it matches some route in here, it goes to a controller, it goes to a view template, and the response comes back. There's one little caveat to that that I did not mention. And that caveat is that the public folder always takes precedence over any dynamic route specified here. These are called dynamic routes. Okay. Anything that matches in the public folder first will always take precedence over what matches in the routes file. Okay. And by default, the slash will match something like index.html. So because there's a matching file, index.html, in the public folder, that takes precedence to the routes. It's just like if you had a home.html in here, that would actually kill this route. It would take precedence over this route. Okay, so if anything that you type in as a request matches something in the public folder first, that's what will be served up. Okay, not something in your dynamic route. So if you're ever wondering why is my dynamic route not working, check your public folder first. Okay. Now, there's a really easy way to get around this, for our purposes at least. I mean, this index.html was just a dummy page that we created just to serve it up. We actually don't need this anymore. This is not our home page anymore, right? So all we're going to do is delete this, okay? So in Sublime, you should be able to right-click and delete. If you can't do that, I think I might have a plugin that maybe some of you guys don't have. Simply delete it in your Finder or your Windows Explorer, okay? So Rails projects, test app, public, and just delete the index.html file. Okay, with that gone, now there's no file in here that matches that /. So now it will use this root folder, okay? And so if I refresh, we actually get our home page that we wanted. Okay, so the two things that I just mentioned for the routes, whatever roots or routes, one is to use the root command, and secondly, that the public folder always takes precedence over dynamic routes, okay? And by the way, in case you're wondering, if there are two conflicting routes here, okay, if you had something like get home pages contact, okay, well, these are conflicting routes, right? Which matches? It's top to bottom, whatever first match hits, okay? That's the routes. And just before that, I talked about not needing the render method in here. And then before that, it was all about ERB, okay? So I recommend you start playing around a little bit with ERB, see if you can like play around with this array and style this even and do whatever you want with this, okay? So I'm gonna hang on just for a couple of seconds here, or minutes. If you guys have any questions, just ask them. Otherwise, I'm going to end this lecture. And next week, next Monday, I believe we do have a room. Follow me on Twitter. It's CaseyLee23. Twitter.com/CaseyLee23. Okay, or stay tuned to the TutoRails website. If you forgot it, if you missed anything during this lecture, don't worry. It is hopefully recorded. It is hopefully recorded, and it will be on YouTube shortly after. And in fact, I always post the Hangout videos on the website here. But other than that, I want to thank everyone who joined us. Hopefully, we'll see some of you next week. Hopefully, you guys learn some really cool things about ERB. It is a very cool, very, very cool thing indeed. So. There's a lot you can do when you start putting Ruby code in HTML, and you'll see when we come in the future, it'll be really cool because you can basically have requests doing things like reading from the database and then using those values from the database in your template. Okay, so you may say if I go to users/2. Then it'll bring up that user's profile. If I go to users/3, it'll bring up another user's profile, and so on and so forth. So really cool things you can do with ERB. Okay, so doesn't look like there's any questions. Again, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully this was a successful broadcast today. It would be really annoying if it wasn't. But again, in 10-15 minutes, I'll probably be posting this. Actually, maybe a little bit after that. I have to go out and run some errands. But hopefully we'll see some of you guys next week in person. Looking forward to getting back in the classroom with you guys. Okay, thanks again. We'll talk to you guys later.